Carmen is Lorraine and Alan Bressler Curator of Contemporary Art at the MFA Boston, and recently co-curated collection presentations, Rituals for Remembering María Magdalena Campos-Pons and Ana Mendieta, and Counter History, Contemporary Art from the Collection. Previously, she was Associate Curator for the Brooklyn Museum Center for Feminist Art, where she curated María Magdalena Campos-Pons' Behold, Baseera Khan, I Am an Archive, Kameelah Janan Rasheed, Are We Reading Closely? Clearly I'm not reading closely, as I'm stumbling over this. Roots of the Dinner Party, History in the Making, and formed part of the curatorial collective for Nobody Promised You Tomorrow, Art 50 Years After Stonewall. She organized the Brooklyn presentations of Liza Lou, Trailer, Radical Women, Latin American Art, 1960-1985, and Andy Warhol, Revelation, and co-curated Half the Picture, A Feminist Look at the Collection, among many other projects. Carmen has also worked as the Assistant Curator for collections at the Guggenheim and the collections of the Whitney Museum and the Museum of Modern Art. Her independent projects include Currents, An Overwhelming Response at Air Gallery, and New Voices on Transformation at the Print Center in New York, 2023. And I think he worked actually with Providence artist Lois Harada, who was very sad not to be here tonight. Carmen received her BA in Art History and English from the University of Richmond and her MA in Art History from Hunter College. In 2019, she was honored by Project for Empty Space with a Badass Art Woman Award. We are so thrilled to have you here. And before you start, I just want to say thank you to Arts, Culture, and Tourism, who supported this event, and to the Wedding Cake House, who very lovely accommodation and supporting Carmen for her stay here. Thank you so much. I think Carmen will give a talk. We'll have plenty of time for a Q&A. Tory Fair protest flowers is what you see around you. A lot of it wiggles and jiggles and moves and flips. We've turned that off for the moment, but we'll rush to get that on in case you didn't catch our opening last week. That exhibition will be up all summer long with some events that we'll let you know about. But it's so nice to have you here. Thank you for running through the rain. I know it's wild out there, but without further ado, Carmen, thank you so much.
Hi everyone, how are you guys doing?
Good.
Thank you, Kate, for the amazing introduction, for the amazing invitation to be here. I also want to thank Michael for being a part of all this and organizing so much, and to Tori, of course, for enlivening and beautifying this space. Can't wait to see it turned on. And yeah, I'm just so excited to be here. Like Kate said, I'm sort of new to the area. I started in September in my role at the MFA, so I'm still learning, and I look forward to your Q&A. This is being recorded, but the Q&A won't be, so please, feedback, advice, etc. So I was, trying to do something a little different than my usual institutional chit-chat about what I've done, and so I wanted to I went back in time and thought about the origins of me as a curator, as a young person, thinking about what I wanted to do, and I wanted to tie together some of the shows that I had the pleasure of curating, and thinking through in a different way some of the connections between them and why I would talk to you about them. And so I've been thinking a lot about the moment that we're in, like we all are. If you're on Instagram, I'm sure you just see endless horrors like I do, and I'm a people person. I love people. I think that's why I've always been working in museums. And I feel like that kind of promise, whether it's a reality or a promise of the public, has always been very inspirational to me. And just like the core of artists and artwork being made by people, for people, I know those are loaded terms, even just as simple prepositions or whatever they are. And I also thought a lot about when I was 18 and I was really into Goya, who's still my second favorite artist, after whatever artist I'm currently obsessed with at the moment. But I was, growing up in a family, my mom took me to museums, and she's a very proud woman of Spain. My dad's from Spain too, and so I was really inculcated into this heavily hierarchical belief system of these male geniuses. But I felt like there was always something incredible about Goya in particular, and his work has been coming to mind a lot lately, and I think, I relate to the drowning dog that he made sort of towards the end of his life. We can understand him. Many people think he was the first modern artist, an artist living with a disability, suddenly that, he had a life change. So that came up. This was painted, directly onto the walls of his home. So this is something that he's living with, right? It wasn't made for the court like his previous works were. I ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on Goya and his kind of performativity of how he social climbed through the ranks through his paintings and self-portraits. But many people also know and love Goya for his incredible acerbic critical look at the clergy, at the government, and I think the Curatior series that he made in 1799 just keeps coming to mind, right? We're living in this time of extreme abuse, racism, horror, anti-Semitism, just like everything is bubbling, and it's kind of also coded and not coded. And so I was thinking about the way that he made this great series that we can read, and we can read the blurbs, and we can understand what he was referring to, but was really kind of going under the radar. And I think there's always rage and power and a kind of person doing something and saying something. So these are some of the ideas that were kind of bopping around, so I decided to bring things together. So in these kind of ideas of rage and people, right? The people being collective, or the people being a resolute artist with their visionary belief in themselves and what they have to say and what's missing. I was blessed, of course, to work at the Brooklyn Museum, where the Center for Feminist Art houses the Great Dinner Party by Judy Chicago. So I started at the Brooklyn Museum in 2016, mere months before Trump was elected the first time. And so I was in the Center for Feminist Art. So obviously when Trump comes to power, things got spicier, they got heavier. We were all of a sudden, had always been thinking about feminist art before I got there, right? It was established in 2007, opening with this piece at its core, and it is still the core of the center. But just again, a few months into my time there, we were celebrating the 10th anniversary of the center. 2017 was just a year away. And so I was, I had known and loved this piece. I'm sure many of you know this great work, in some ways a stand-in for sort of 1970s feminism, white feminism. It's an incredible work of art that tells the story of Western civilization through the lives and imagery of 1,038 women. So there's 13 across the table, 999 on the heritage floor. There's a system of understanding, knowledge sharing. Craft, of course, is elevated, right? Judy Chicago always wanted this to be in a museum where it would be on par with the paintings and sculptures of the greats like Goya. And it's a powerful piece. Don't want to spend too much time talking about it. Ask in Q&A if you want to go deep. But when I spent time in the galleries with my people person self, taking too long for tours and listening to the questions, the Brooklyn Museum audience is very critical. And it was, I knew about the racial critique of the dinner party, but actually spending time with people in the space and hearing, what does it feel like to go around Western civilization and wait your turn? What does it feel like to find that turn is a little bit unsettling for some, right? Not always related to one's ethnic, racial background or what have you. But when I was tasked with doing a show on the dinner party, I wanted to really expand out and look at the labor, the making, right? Because it is iconic, but what is an icon and how is an icon made, and what are the messes? So I came here to Radcliffe, where Judy Chicago's papers are held, well, here being there in Boston. But yeah, they researched 3,000 women, and they being the almost 400 people who helped Judy Chicago execute this work over 5 years. And it was fascinating for me to see who didn't make it, right? Judy Chicago and her team had a system of wanting to have enough information that they could not be questioned, right? So that you couldn't say hey, I can't find that, right? This is a stub. This is somebody who needs to be researched further. But it was interesting to see who they balanced, who they could find information of. And they also wanted to create an image, right? Like an artwork, right? So it also had to be something that had a visual resonance. I could go on about the dinner party, but I won't. So this show, which opened in 2017, was looking at the visual research and conceptual development of this great work. And so, we walked through the vulvas and where those came from, the central core imagery, the impulses of abstraction and honorific culture. And one of the things I really wanted to address was this kind of idea of what happens when this rubric of honoring women, putting them at the table, bringing them together, sort of, is met with its own challenges of who's making the work and who was helping with the work and who was seen and not seen. So one of the things that I researched, the dinner party, I'm just gonna go back for 1 second. Dinner party has an epic history, the 5 years of its making, but then what I find almost just as inspirational and impressive is that it then traveled on a 13-venue tri-continental tour that was DIY organized by the feminists and art lovers of each city it went to. And so it did come to the Cyclorama in Boston, funded by the people of Boston. it came to the Brooklyn Museum, one of the only museums to show it, because of course when it debuted in '79 at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, even though it was their most popular show ever, it was critically panned and not beloved at all by the art people. And so that story itself is fascinating to me. And I read the comic books from 1980, right? So reading comments from Cheryl Lynn Bruce, the actress who appears in Daughters of the Dust. And this is a lot of text to read, but just to highlight here, she's kind of going through this staggering project, care, dedication, scholarship, creativity, and disfiguring racism through diminution, right? Where are my sisters of the East? And then she talks about the way that Sojourner Truth, who is the only Black woman to appear on the dinner party, kind of collects all the Black women from across history around her by virtue of her background, instead of them being associated with the professions, how everybody else is organized, right? And then on the right, a lesbian who was understandably irate at the fact that lesbians were called lovers of women in the kind of rubric of the dinner party. She says, like, how many lesbians made this possible, right? This piece itself. And so kind of looking at the comment books, right? But as you can see above too, inspiring, model, beautiful. Time and time again, every single page I read, I did not know women had this history. And so one thing I worked very closely with Judy Chicago on is a section kind of devoted to and unpacking that problematic. So this was a really amazing experience, obviously working with Judy Chicago, but then also understanding, you know, how do you kind of approach these ideas? How do you just meet them head on, right? Rather than kind of bury it into a couple wall labels and let it sort of be something that like the real readers find out, you know, how do we kind of, what I think about sometimes in my work is like, pop the bubble of the poison and just like let it be talked about, right? And so Judy Chicago at this point had lived and been in some ways identified as the dinner party for over 40 years, you know? And so this was something that she was very well aware of. Alice Walker wrote a piece critiquing it right the year it came out. And so this was something that was kind of, it was interesting for me to like disambiguate all the labor that went to the dinner party, while also recognizing that that same system of labor, who was able to take time off of work and go to Santa Monica and live for free and, you know, work in the system, who, you know, what books did they use, what books did they not use, what networks did they have and not have? So some of these kind of questions, making them seen on the wall. I'm gonna kind of skip through this. Also, like, what time did I start? Because I said I would keep an eye.
No, you're good. You have to keep going.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
You've got so much
Great.
time.
Thank you. And so collection work has always kind of been at the heart. You know, I've worked in collections in various ways and seeing how museums structure, hierarchize, hide, show, display, bring into storage, back into storage. It's always been something that percolates in my mind. So the next year, kind of on the heels of this 10th anniversary celebration, we decided, myself and Catherine Morris, who's the senior curator at the Center for Feminist Art, we did a show about, we called it Half the Picture based on the Guerrilla Girls. But, you know, 2 years into that Trump administration, you know, the headlines, you know, the possibility that abortion would be taken away, the protests that were happening, even the rewriting of art history, we decided to kind of use these quote unquote hot button themes in the feminist world as the themes of the show, but what we did was sort of zoom out and show it across 100 years of art making, right? So to kind of contextualize that these things come and go, right? And these cycles of change and regression and advancement and backlash, like are just kind of built into the way the patriarchy and we all like to stain each other. So these are some of the highlights that were in that show, you know, making systems of labor and exploitation visible. Some of the artists there of Yolanda Lopez, Nona Faustine, and Dara Birnbaum in various media. And thinking too about how in the Feminist Center, yes, of course, like women is a big part of it, but thinking also about how since the Feminist Center opened, there was kind of this impulse to try to represent that feminism could be like a joining thing and not as separatist as it sometimes can be perceived. And so bringing in artists like Dred Scott or the histories of the Gráfica Popular and thinking about like what are the conditions of society that require attention, that require change, that require at least conversation. And these are some of the acquisitions that I was able to bring into the museum and put on view in that show for the first time. So with Stacy Lynn Waddell's work, always hard to see in reproduction, but this is effectively a very large, almost 8 foot tall drawing that's gilded of the artist Maren Hassinger. And she made this in 2017, and Maren Hassinger is standing on a tiny, tiny, tiny General Beauregard, the Confederate general, And this was an image that was made when Stacy Lynn Waddell and Marion Hassinger were both in residence at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans. So they were witnessing this change, witnessing this achievement, right, of toppling the Confederate monuments. And, Stacy Lynn Waddell, of course, playing with the idea of not just marking that moment and reproducing the type of graffiti, from a photograph that she took of that empty plinth, but then replacing this history with somebody like Marion Hassinger. And then Wendy Red Star's work, if you're interested in museums and collections in the back of the house history, I think this is just a foundational, incredible work that she made about it's called the 1880 Pro-Peace Delegation. And she takes these much circulated images by the white male artist Charles Milton Bell of the 1880 Pro-Peace Delegation, and shows us in kind of the red ink of the museum condition report the humor, the specificity, the references, who this person was, what did they like, who were they married to, what did all these objects mean to them as they dressed to go to this delegation where effectively they were dispossessed, right? And so you have this kind of exchange between the state and the individual and the person. It's a great series. It's 10 photographs, and this is just one excerpt. Then I got to shout out Nobody Promised You Tomorrow. We've got LJ Roberts in the house, and their work here resplendent in the center, and also Chiara Manarino, who was a necessary collaborator on this project. I love you both forever. And so this was another work thinking, okay, wait, I didn't talk about why Judy Chicago was rage, but maybe it's obvious, right? The absence, the lack of attention to women, the idea that Western civilization existed without women, and the idea that she was raised with, she talks about going to school and being told, women didn't contribute anything, and that was a history that she felt she had to excavate. And she talks a lot about the anger that inspired her to go big, go maximalist. And so thinking about this show in 2019, as the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising approached, at the Brooklyn Museum and the Feminist Center, we were hearing, that there were many incredible historic exhibitions being planned that would look specifically at 1969, the artists who were there, the images that were taken, the changes that were wrought in its immediate aftermath. But we were thinking, and the we here includes these fabulous group of people, Margot Cohen-Rustarucci, Lindsay Harris, Ali Ricard, Lauren Argentinas Zelaya, and Levi Lorraine. So this was a curatorially, collectively organized show, so that peopleness coming forward again. And we thought about what if we just shifted the frame, right? What if instead of, as was rightly happening at many other institutions, thinking about that history in its moment, what if we recognize that, yes, this is a historic moment to be celebrated, but what does it mean 50 years later if the same conditions of police brutality and lack of access to healthcare and homelessness and of course transphobia, homophobia, like these things are still so persistent in the US, in New York, where most of these artists were from. And what would it look like to explore, being born after a movement, right? Where there's kind of the slippage between, again, like what are the advancements, what are the backlashes, how do you survive amidst all that, right? I know we're like living through it again. And so this show had 28 artists and collectives. So you have LJ Roberts' great monument here at its center, a flickering, archivally based monument honoring the life of Stormy DeLavray, who was eliminated or excluded from a New York Times report about the Stonewall Uprising that she had such a hand in. But it goes back and it looks at her almost 100 years of living, right? So it's not always about that moment and that historical framing that becomes so monumentalized and outside. But LJ just so brilliantly brings together quotations, reflections, archival imagery, scraps of their dog hair, the tenderness of what it looks like to take an archive on and spend time with it, but making it huge and monumental. So this piece is currently on view at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, where it's in the collection there, and it's facing down an image of our current president. So that's amazing. So that's why I love artists. This is the artist list. I also wanted to shout out the work of Electra KB. The piece on the right is actually a print that they made, inspired by the banner that you see hanging there in the distance. This is from the section that we call Revolt. And I'd actually seen, I didn't know it was Electra at the time, but I saw this image on the right in a Women's Day march 2 years before this. It was held as a banner. I saw it somewhere in the West Village, and I was like, damn, I love that poster. What's going on there? And at the time, it didn't have the text, that was never yours. It was just sort of this image borrowed from the Soviet poster of a woman, taking control, stabbing down on the KKK. And so then I was at spring break and I see this piece by Lecter, Nation and Abstraction. I start talking to them. We do a studio visit for the show, and I realize this is an artist whose work I saw literally used at protests. And so they bring the posters back, repair them, fix them up for museum or whatever display, but they exist and they are made for use in the streets. This was the second section on heritage. So we had David Antonio Cruz, whose work you might recognize, was based here in Boston for a bit. A section on desire, a section on care networks and how we sustain each other. LJ, I'm going to shout you out again, okay? Your work just looks so good in the installation images. And so this was a show that we also wanted to concretize and make space for the processing. Museums often don't let that happen, whether there's not a bench or not a place. And I have mixed feelings with the response wall, which I'll talk about for a single artist show later. But in this case, it was kind of the perfect show to ask, in this show that's thinking about the heroes or the figures of the past, whether that's Stormy DeLabray or Marsha P. Johnson, or who would you want to honor? So that was an incredible archive that the museum still retains of people, maybe putting forward other activists or maybe their aunt or whoever, helped inspire their lives within this framework of queer liberation. And it also had at the center there in this room kind of community takeaways from long-standing partnerships between the Brooklyn Museum's Public Programs Department, not curatorial, but Public Programs Department, and groups that advocate for trans healthcare, immigrant rights, any number of ways that people exist and take care of each other in the world, and then also a little library. So Nobody Promised You Tomorrow, in many ways for me in my heart, is a little golden standard show, and I love it. Not too long after, I was invited to jury the themed open call at the Feminist Gallery, AIR Gallery in Brooklyn, that was begun by, many feminist artists of the late 70s when they were not being shown in galleries, so they decided to make their own gallery to support and sustain other women artists. And so you set a theme, and we were deep into the Trump era, and so I decided to do gaslighting as a theme. It's an open call, so that kind of put out a big framing idea, and then as the work comes in, the show gets more specific. So you're seeing here work by Leandra Lasser, Deborah Hirsch, Bernadette Disbucoles, Mimi Bai, and then on the right, Becky Brown, artist who works with text. And I just brought this forward because I was just feeling it these days. There was many serious works about the disappearance of your own experience against larger narratives, whether it's the state gaslighting you, a partner gaslighting you, the way that internet culture contributes to this, right? Sort of, again, this backlash movement of people, conversations, punishment, what have you, these kind of swirling realities. It's supposed to be a very current show. That's where the currents comes from. But when I was reviewing it yesterday, I decided to bring forward Becky's work because I just feel like we're living in an incredibly emotionally intense time. And so this idea of you're manic, but then you're also numb, and you're kind of trying to compartmentalize, but then you're moving forward. As somebody who loves to go to museums, and I just visited the RISD Museum today for the first time, you're looking at our history, and in the back of your head, you're like, oh my God, this is happening again, or I can't believe, or I wish I saw Athena with the chest plate made of snakes, and I was like, I need that. And so, I feel like I like to think about how people feel in the space too. And then I also like to think about my coworkers. So recently when I've given some talks, people ask me to talk about my union organizing, so I just want to shout it out here, and it's not my union organizing, but the union organizing that takes place. And because, the AIR Parent Show opened early 2020, what happens, COVID, lockdown, layoffs, people getting their lives destabilized. So I was also a part of this mutual aid network here for Brooklyn Museum. And we had a debate within the little organizing group, whether interns or people who were a PR person who got hired as a consultant for a few months would be a part of this mutual aid distribution, right? Who would qualify? And we were kind of scared because we were like, well, we're not going to raise enough money for everyone. But that was something that we decided, okay, we're just going to open it up, right? So it was very successful, and it was a good way to remember that we got to take care of each other. So I also shouted out here, if you follow me on Instagram, you've been hearing this, but I also am collecting funds for my friend Salma Ramadan and her family in Gaza. So you can follow me on Instagram and find out more. If you've been looking for a way to help somebody on the ground, that's a way. And then moving forward into other solo exhibitions. So this is Baseera Khan's I Am an Archive. They won the Wovo Prize for Emerging Artists based in Brooklyn, which is a relatively new initiative at the museum. And so thinking about people and histories and rage, they are an artist who is bringing forward all these emotions, very, I would say, a work that appears conceptual and is conceptual and has a lot of theory behind it, but has a very strong emotional tenor too. Here you see literally the chopped up Corinthian columns that you would find on the front of museums everywhere, wrapped in Kashmiri rugs, hollow, they're made of pink housing insulation material, right? So also talking about displacement in the now, but also the imperial core, right? The emptiness of it all. So they're kind of hollow in between. You can see through the plexi this like pink-orange cast there, the one that's tilted. You get the sense that this is an immense object that we are able to destabilize, and you could really toss this around the gallery, but it was being installed as very lightweight. And so Baseera Khan is an artist who thinks about, these histories of imperialism and colonialism and the violence they have long brought on places like Kashmir, thinking about, its imposition between India and Pakistan at the moment, but then also thinking about these structures, of course, within museums as these emblems of colonialism and imperialism, places where that kind of dirty work abroad brought things home for us to look at. And so Baseera was inspired by, again, in the same era of the COVID lockdown, during a time when people weren't able to go to the museum. Since they had a solo show at the museum, they were able to go to the museum. And they were able to go to the back of the house, where a lot of the Arts of the Islamic World collection, which was not then on view, but now has a beautiful display, was held, right? So they decided in their way, an artist who's very inspired by histories of performance and criticality, to kind of re-perform and gather and select objects that resonated with them. So these works contain multitudes. This is a brief talk, but in the kind of course of the idea of collectivity, people, rage, these were just some of the images that Baseera created against physical backdrops, pink and green and black screens that were behind them in the photo studio, where they sort of become these posters, right? So they feel like they could be operating in a street, in a place, but then they also show that sleight of hand between conservation and what's seen and unseen, and what's the ghost and what's the presence of these collections and these objects within a museum. Okay. I'm gonna pick up the pace, I think. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you. The Wovo Prize, bless you. Part of it is to create new work. And so the Arts of the Islamic World engagement that would become the Law of Antiquity series was just one of the many new works that Baseera created. They also created those hanging gorgeous chandeliers you see up top, inspired by textile designs in their family collection. And then they created this incredible performative sculpture. Maybe we could come back to this, but this is a work that involves 3D body scan, their actual hair. It is a reference to an object in the Met and Brooklyn Museum collection, these images of bodies. They have been ruptured and fragmented by the removal of them from their temple homes by colonialism. So, Baseera kind of takes this on, inhabits it, but with a sense of talk back. So it's called the bust of cannons, and you can see that their bust is literally kind of broken open, and what emerges in that space is a speaker playing an album that Baseera made for this show. So there's this kind of sense that you have a sculpture that normally doesn't talk to you. And it was actually kind of, I know Baseera would appreciate me saying this, experimental in the sense that Baseera's like, what am I doing? I've always secretly wanted to be a rock star, but I can't sing. But they kind of inhabited that space of like self-belief and affirmation. I was like, no, I can be the male rock star. Plenty of male rock stars can't sing. And so it was kind of this space of play and humor, but the pieces were also about, their emotions, what it means to show here, what it means to be caught between your family's expectations, your own expectations for yourself, the museum, the art world, like these kind of layers all emerging from the sculpture. Now I've got to get to my favorite, María Magdalena Campos-Pons. I'm so proud of this show. It just concluded its tour. I couldn't have asked for a more dreamy kind of on-ramp to the MFA Boston. So this is one of my last final projects at the Brooklyn Museum, a survey of this great artist's work. Anyone know her? She was working, yes. She was a longtime professor at SMFA Tufts, inspired many of the artists who are also on view at the MFA, which I'll bring up those images in a moment. But this was an example of, an artist who was resolute in her vision, right? Thinking about the histories of spirituality in her community, and then the actual presence of spiritual practices of Santeria in her life. So what I loved about this show was 1,000 things. She works in performance, it's performance, it's photography, there's narrative, there's abstraction, there's a lot of emotion, right? We call the work Behold because there's this kind of, the show Behold, there's kind of recurring experience between looking and feeling and acting in her work. And there's kind of this cycle, there's crying, there's rain, there's fire, and it just operates on so many different forms. This was an introductory gallery where we would kind of weave people through the narrative of her life, born in 1959 at the onset of the Cuban Revolution, right? Living in a time of promise where art was, elevated and seen as part of society and necessary to social change. Until that kind of collapses, she has to move to Boston, she leaves her family. All those narratives were there, and this gallery in particular was thinking about spiritual references in her work. But also, if you know Yoruba culture and you know the orishas, you don't have to read anything. You can just tell from the colors of the gallery, of the works in the gallery, which orisha was being invoked and how they were being combined in her work and what those spiritual powers referenced. And so I love that kind of swing in her work always. Very materially experimental. This was the section called Voyeurs and Beholders. So you're seeing here Polaroid photography that itself contains sculpture and paint and hair, and then sculptural glass, photography mixed with paint, made compartmentalized. She has a small studio. Things get very big, and she does that by thinking in fragments, right? In the way that our lives are combined and made from fragments. So there was a lot of power and awesomeness in the show. One of the sections I thought I was most proud of or inspired around was working around the idea of labor. Labor as it relates to kind of the histories of enslavement and indenture that were reflected in Cuba, where her family is from, in Matanzas, in her own family line, reflected in Boston and New England with the way that wealth was dispersed up here, right, and taken in these extreme violent situations. But then what I found in her work too was this kind of recurrent theme of labor, the labor of the artist, the labor of the mother, the labor of the body, and so bringing that together into one space and, really talking with an artist, with Judy Chicago, there was kind of a constant stream of conversation. And with Campos-Pons, there were different ways that we related to each other. We were always in touch, but it was, she's somebody who has a lot of activity and she's always thinking about her next performance. And so in this case, it was kind of like, when I introduced this idea to her, she was like, I don't know. And then she returned to it and she was like, actually, it ties my entire career together. And there was kind of this incredible, just weirdness too of reminding ourselves within all of this, swing between the people and the actions and the world and the horrors about what it means to have an object in front of you and what it means to see a relic of a making and labor and what is contained in that. And so with her, there's 1,000 different surfaces. Okay, I'm gonna pick up the pace because I feel like I need more time. I'm sorry to just constantly ask you.
You're great. No, you're let's say another 7 or 8 minutes.
Perfect.
Sure, we'd all like to hear more. So
No, I want to get to the Q&A. I'm sorry to be informal, but Kate told me that this was not my shot, so you guys are a warm crowd. And so with Campos-Pons, I think there's a lot to say about the resilience and the connection to her spirituality, her family, thinking back and reflecting there. And so when I was kind of trying to think, okay, is there rage in this work? There is and there isn't. I think there's something around the idea of grief itself being something that comes from that impulse of asking why or asking how could this be? And this piece in particular, the one that carried the fire, definitely came to mind. We have this tiny miniature portrait of the artist's head at the base of this rather large, 34-inch each triptych. And within the triptych too, it's kind of separated. So this is one paper, right? 1, 2, 3. So again, creating scale, creating an overwhelming experience from small component parts, but each painted to overlap. And in this case, you have hair, fire, growth, right? When you take a close look at it, you can see that flowers are blooming within the fire. And this piece also begins, there's a recurrent energy that we designed in her survey where, I guess I didn't mention this, but some of these feminist center shows, like Nobody Promised You Tomorrow, and Behold, it's literally surrounding the dinner party. So that gallery was designed for the dinner party, which can be a beautiful thing, it can be a challenging thing. It can sometimes be a confusing thing for our visitors who ask me, like, when did Baseera make the dinner party as we were walking by it one day? But, you know, somebody like Campos-Pons, she describes, she actually, when she came to Boston in 1988 to study at Mass Art, she saw Judy speaking here because of the dinner party coming to the cyclorama. And Campos-Pons talked about, you know, I realized I could do anything. That was like literally her quote, right? She's like, I go back to Cuba and realize, like, if she could do the dinner party, like, I'm going to tell these stories that need to be told. There's a beautiful relationship there, but also it is a lot, right, to have your works around this icon where, you know, icons need to be destabilized, questions expanded, etc. But in that case of Campos-Pons' work, kind of this recurrent attention to and care for her family too, and this detail, that little tiny orange orb, actually a doodle that her son made, and then she turned that just little trace of something that she thought was great that her son painted into this large-scale piece that contains so much power and fire. So then this is the on-ramp to what I have been doing since I arrived at the MFA Boston in September. So it's been a fantastic experience, and I'm blessed to start with the collection. And that's a real education, you know, to get into a place like the MFA and to be able to dive into what's there. When I was working on Behold, I heard the good news that the MFA Boston had purchased the town portrait that you see here. So this was a recent acquisition that we're putting on view, and it is now on view. And we ended up kind of really just grounding this new unfurling of the contemporary galleries through Magda's work, through the town portrait. So when you come to see the exhibition, if you haven't yet, so until February 15th, you'll see multiple works by Campos-Pons. You'll see an ephemera case dedicated to some of the work and experiences she had in Boston, whether that was exhibitions of her own work. She also ran a gallery in Brookline called GASP, Gallery Artist Studio Projects. And her mission for GASP, in addition to literally making the walls, the floors, the studios herself, you know, I'm here at Ogden, and I feel like the fortitude of a vision, the fortitude of getting it done, like, this is a sacred space. She often talked about, like, I made the space, and it wasn't, you know, didn't really make the cut in some of the essays about her work that were circulated, you know, so, you know, that question of what is archive, what is not, like, the people who went to GAS, the artists who were shown there, they weren't forgetting it, right? But it was something about bringing it forward specifically in Boston. Something I thought was very inspirational in terms of, like, people and how we can shape things up is that she always endeavored the group shows, which they were all group shows, to have student artists, emerging artists, and established artists together. So she really wanted to sort of eradicate those boundaries and recognize that, like, all art is an inquiry and experimentation. Even the most established artists change direction, change their mind, try something new, and, like, the idea of failure and success, you know, are fuzzy when you come to art. And again, these objects that you're in front of, and these ideas and these evocations of a people or a feeling, right? And so in the case of a town portrait, it's formidable, it's monumental. This is a piece that she made in '94 when she was a fellow at Radcliffe. And she was 3 years into her life in Boston. She was the only person in her family to leave Cuba. She was, of course, missing them. She was talking to her mother and her aunts and her female cousins on the phone and writing them letters. And so when you see this piece in person, it's covered in language. And all that language is the words of the women in her family describing their experiences seeing and living inside of this town, the town portrait, La Vega, which is not where she was born, but where she lived for many years with her family. And what she would come to understand was the sugar, you know, the remnants of the sugar industry, right? So the sugar industry being where her family, from her present-day Nigerian side, and also her Chinese ancestors were, you know, enslaved and indentured in this system of production for, again, places like Boston, right, where this would kind of disseminate and be distributed as wealth. And so in this case, she's literally monumentalizing these words. She was thinking, she always thinks about materials, but she was thinking about that permanence of form. So you see ceramic and metal and glass, but it's also very handwritten. So you know that this is not an official archive. It's not the official story, but she's setting it out that it is the official story. And so the series, this is just the first in what would become a trilogy called The History of a People Who Were Not Heroes, also includes the performance and the spirituality and the cleansing, those 3 videos at the side, in addition to being this portrait of the town where you have the fountain that she would play ring around the rosy in, the cooling tower of the factory, the crumbling wall, the doorway to their home. And so this kind of presence, this place, and an opportunity to show her work in some depth, we also decided to bring forward Ana Mendieta's work, which the MFA has some fantastic examples of. Beyond being, Cuban artists, feminist artists, they're artists who are thinking about spirituality, ritual, what's the trace that we leave behind, what are the traces that some people can see, but need to be drawn out. And so, they never met each other, of course. Ana Mendieta died too young, and there is a conversation here that, I hope you'll come to see in the galleries again, behind this kind of idea of, what is the history that appears and disappears. Walking through the galleries recently too, with some teens and talking about they were like, oh, I could make that. And I thought that was so empowering, right? Hey, it's the idea, so probably this teen can't make this. But I thought there was something so open about that too, right? You're in a museum with a capital M, and it's art history with a capital A, and they're seeing something that's touching them, but they're recognizing, oh my gosh, this is just constructed of flowers kind of at the water's edge. Of course, Mendieta, this was building on her experiences, right? If Campos-Pons came to Boston as an adult and made a choice, Mendieta was brought at age 12 with her sister, and they were living in refugee spaces, they were living in foster homes in Iowa, and fortunately, by virtue of her mother fighting for it, she and her sister were kept together, which was very rare for the 14,000 children that the US government, airlifted out of Cuba in this Operation Pedro Pan. And anti-communist movement's coming back, right? We're seeing the same questions of which countries and people are allowed and not allowed and right and wrong. And so, she grew up in Iowa, she went to school in Iowa, and that's where she was in this great program of performance and photography, right? So kind of these encounters that are fraught, to put it lightly. And so we opened that at the same time as Counter History, curated with Ian Altsmeer, who's the chair of the Contemporary Department at MFA Boston, and Liza Lou, who was a curatorial assistant. Got to shout out my colleague Michelle Miller-Fisher in the back over there. It's been an awesome time working at the MFA Boston, and this is just a great chance to bring out some of these conversations and histories, recent acquisitions, long-standing work. Here's one of the recent acquisitions, Sharon Hayes' piece from the Whitney Biennial, which is an 80-minute conversation with 3 different groups of queer elders in Tennessee, in Florida, and Tennessee, LA, and Philly, excuse me. And it's been fun watching people sit here. It's been fun listening, recurring. I get to walk through the galleries and hear a different moment, but it's just a reflection, right, on the peopleness of it all, right? There's so much individuality and uniqueness to all of us. The people who appear in this video where Sharon Hayes is asking questions, research. It comes from this Piero Pasolini movie he made in the 60s, asking Italians about the changing social mores and sexual experiences of the time. And so Sharon Hayes is asking, what's happening now, what's happening then, that swing between the past and the present that appears in Campos-Pons' work, this idea of the counter history and the monument that she was putting forward. This ends up being a very capacious way to divulge this collection and share with y'all. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts along the way. And I think that's it. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. Thank you.